Good afternoon. Is this on? Can you hear? Okay. Before I say anything else, those of you in the balcony, if you can't, if your visual line is obstructed in any way, I'd like to invite you right now to please move down to the first floor. There are plenty of good seats available. My name is Gerald McKenney. I'm an associate professor of Christian ethics in the Department of Theology here at Notre Dame. And it's a great pleasure for me to moderate and introduce this session for this afternoon, The Culture of Life After September 11th, a panel discussion. I'd especially like to thank our three presenters for being willing to discuss this topic on what must have been short notice, because I'm sure this program was planned long before September 11th. I will keep my remarks and my interference to an absolute minimum. I'll just explain briefly how the format will proceed here, and then I will introduce the three distinguished speakers. Each speaker will have a presentation of up to about 20 minutes successively. After all three presentations have been completed, we will open up the floor to discussion. So we should have a good 15 or 20 minutes for discussion. I will introduce the speakers in order of their appearance, and I will introduce all three of them before the first one begins to speak in order to maximize the flow here. Our first presenter is Professor John Haldane, who's head of the School of Philosophical and Anthropological Studies at the University of St. Andrews. His PhD is from the University of London. He's the co-author of a vigorous volume with J.J.C. Smart on atheism and theism. He's also the editor of 4 books and 3 journal issues, and author of about 100 articles ranging over the fields of aesthetics, education, ethics, history of philosophy, philosophy of mind, social and political philosophy, and as Goethe's Faust may have put it, last of all, theology. He, in addition to being the Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, he's also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Our second speaker is Thomas Hibbs, who's Associate Professor of, Professor of Philosophy, I believe, at Boston College. His PhD is from the University of Notre Dame in Medieval Studies. Professor Hibbs is the author of 2 books on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he's also a person of very diverse interests. He's authored a book on nihilism in American culture. He's also editor of 2 books and of numerous articles that have appeared in journals, including the Review of Metaphysics, the Thomist, and the International Philosophical Quarterly. The third presenter is the Reverend Michael J. Baxter, CSC. Reverend Baxter is Associate Professor of Theology here at Notre Dame. His PhD is from Duke University. He's the author of a series of very highly thought-provoking and really very interesting articles on Catholic social ethics, especially in the Catholic social ethics tradition here in the United States. He's also the author of numerous essays and reviews, a very popular teacher here at Notre Dame, and a very valuable and valued colleague of mine. So without any further delay, Professor Haldane, he'll be followed by Professor Hibbs and then Professor Baxter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again in Notre Dame. I don't know that Dave Solomon is around, but I should say a little bit about his method of organization. Generally, it involves announcing that you are going to speak to a conference, and then some weeks or months later telling you that he's done this, and working on the assumption that sufficient number of people will feel morally obliged to turn up for the benefit of those people who think you're going to be speaking, that there will be sufficient for a program. Now, He did this once last year, I think it was, and after I discovered that I was on the program, unfortunately it coincided with some other matter, and so I said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm not going to be able to speak. He said, well, don't worry, enough of the others will feel obliged and embarrassed to do so, so it'll be quite all right. But he's entered the room, so I was going to say, yes, I will continue in this theme. I try to make up for that by, I think, giving a lecture, a couple of talks under the auspices of the Centre. But I'm particularly pleased to be able to join in on this occasion and make a contribution. Let me quote from the general brief for this conference that's on the flyers. 3 days, it says, dedicated to examining the possibilities for building a genuine culture of life in our current social context. The overarching goal being to bring scholars and students and others together to articulate the hopeful moral vision expressed in John Paul II's recent encyclicals. That seems to be a very noble and appropriate purpose. I just want to quote further from a couple of the list of specific topics that appear on the flyer, because I want to make a connection between that general brief and these. One of them is to consider the historical roots of our present situation and historical resources for change, and the other is to consider the philosophical foundations of conception of human flourishing. Now, it seems to me that those two specific topics fit very well with the general brief, and there's a linkage that comes, a special linkage, I think, that comes through the writings of John Paul II. I'm thinking here of Fides et Ratio and the appeal that the Pope makes there for the need for philosophers and those whom philosophers advise and inform and to whom they speak to recover the sapiential dimension of philosophy. This does seem to me extremely important, to discover that sense of philosophy as being the practice of the love of wisdom, an effort to try to understand what it is to be a human being, an effort to try to fashion a demeanor, a way of being in the world. I think that is extremely important. I think it's highly relevant to the present circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I'm reading these specific topics in a way in which I think wasn't intended when they were written, considering the historical roots of our present situation, the situation that I'm going to be concerned with, the situation following September the 11th. Now, what I'm going to do in the very short time available, and perhaps our chairman could indicate when I've got 2 minutes or something of that sort. Could you do that for me? I want to try to offer some observations on US reactions to September the 11th, say something about UK reactions to September the 11th, then offer 1 or 2 comments on US-UK parallels and differences, and say something about prospects for the future. And I warn you that some of what I'm going to say is not going to be welcome. I've had the experience on more than one occasion since September the 11th of trying, including in New York at Columbia, trying to address some of these matters and finding that some part of what I wanted to say has been very ill received. All I would ask you is to wait until I've got to the very end. But some of what I have to say about the state and character of American society just now is apparently something that people don't want to have said. I'm a fairly frequent visitor to the United States. I must have been here, I don't know, maybe 30 times. I've lived in the US twice. Currently I'm teaching at Georgetown and living in Arlington, Virginia. But in the 1980s, I was at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and lived in Pittsburgh. So I've had 2 periods of exposure to American society, extended periods, and with many visits in between times. And I suppose my abiding impressions of the United States are ones of admiration of US culture and public policy debates. I think that matters are conducted with a degree of seriousness and rigor that is not matched elsewhere in the English-speaking world, certainly. Now, this, of course, is an elite culture, by and large, of research centres, academics, quasi-academics, commentators in broadsheet newspapers, and so on. So it's not a general participation in public debate, perhaps, but nonetheless, it seems to me where it's done very well indeed. And I say that abstracting from the question of whether you agree with what these opinion makers are saying, just the general conduct of that sort of debate is very good. I'm also an admirer of US intellectual and civic idealism, of which I think that first thing, public debate, is an expression. But I very much admire the tradition of liberal arts colleges, for example, in the United States, that give high priority to the process of education, as contrasted with the ambitions of academics to be excellent researchers, let's say. I mean, currently people talk about research-led teaching. I think this is a kind of dishonesty designed to actually make it possible for academics to do as little engaged teaching as they possibly can, and just get on with telling people about their opinions. But in the US, I think there's a very strong and robust tradition of the liberal arts college, and that I much admire. So that's the background. Now, and I just say about that intellectual and academic culture, it superficially can seem to resemble something that went on in Britain in the 19th century. In the 19th century, there were such things as a Society for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge, and there were mechanics institutes, classes, and so on of this sort. But those were utilitarian in their purpose and instrumental. There was a period of extending education through literacy and so on in England in the 19th century, but generally in the service and in the interest of the economy and of having an educated workforce. Whereas in the US, it seems to me there's a kind of nobility and idealism about the promotion of knowledge, which is the thought that it is in some way a good in itself. I think the roots of that, in part, take us back in the direction of my own native land, because I think the Scottish intellectual formation in the US in the 18th century was quite important, but that's not the subject of this talk. Now, against that background, what do I want to say about the events, the tragic events of September 11th? Well, my abiding impression subsequently has been of a kind of garrulous superficiality masking moral emptiness. My thinking about this began prior to that, because I was been in the country with my family and so on, and in Washington, and encountering some of what that has to offer, but particularly watching or trying to select through the range of television programs, just seeing how much there is that's truly terrible, and thinking about how American media gets serious when serious things happen. Well, something very serious did happen, and a pattern revealed itself that I think is a long-standing pattern, or at least a pattern that goes back perhaps a couple of decades, and it seems to me it's this. When something serious happens in the United States that involves the deaths of people, there's a sort of four-stage development. The first is a kind of instantaneous media dramatization, and that happened as the events were going on September the 11th. And I'll say a little bit more about that, including some of the idiocies, I think, associated with it, and some of the vulgarity associated with it. Then, secondly, what happens is there's a rallying to the victims. Thirdly, then, there's a demand for revenge or justice. And then, fourthly, there's a conspicuous and unquestionable display of patriotism. And I want to say something about the first and the last of those, about the instantaneous media dramatization, and about the conspicuous and unquestionable display of patriotism. Now, I should say, just in case, just to sort of set the scene here, that I regard myself as a moral and cultural conservative. So what I'm going to say is criticism from a conservative perspective. The media. The American media is obviously driven by its commercial character. And something of that entered the United Kingdom when the government decided, I believe unwisely, to license independent television. Up to that point, we had a national broadcasting service. They licensed independent television, and that, I think, was the beginning of the decline of British broadcasting. In the US, of course, it's gone very far. It's sensationalist, it's self-aggrandizing, it's striking the extent to which presenters tell you about themselves. You know, hi, I'm Cindy, I'm down wherever it is, and they keep telling you what their names are, as if this mattered in any way. It's striking the extent to which, you know, the people, the presenters and so on, you know, are beautiful or handsome in rather traditional magazine style. And another thing that's very striking is the instant effort to caption events. Now, one aspect of that I thought was intensely vulgar insensitive and ignorant, was the use of the term ground zero to refer to the location of that disaster. First of all, it was part of this American fascination with the kind of military vocabulary that sounds precise and intense and sharply focused. It was inappropriate because it referred to a quite different kind of circumstance. It was vulgar because it actually nourished the very sense of unreality of those events. As you watched those events, the experience of so many people, I think, was the same, that this was like watching, Bruce Willis Die Hard 3 or whatever it might be, and there was the title of the film, Ground Zero. It was that instant captioning of these events in terms that were meant to be dramatic and resonate in certain ways in accord with sort of advertising culture. It was ignorant and inept because of the circumstance of Osama bin Laden's own intent. There was, in the months preceding September 11th, an interview with Osama bin Laden, which the text of which I recommend people read. It's known that he refers to America as the Great Satan, but this is more of what he had to say. He said, "The snake is America, and we have to stop them. We have to cut off the head of this snake. We can't let the American army into our area. We have to do something. We have to fight them." This was a plea to his colleagues and others to fight, as he saw it, the snake that had entered the garden. And then when he was challenged over the issue of terrorism, of the killing of the innocent, he went on to quote the American use of nuclear weapons against Japanese cities, and to say that in the pursuit of honorable means, it's sometimes necessary to resort to the killing of the innocent, and he cited the American conduct of the Second World War, and indeed he could have cited British pattern bombing and so on. Now, this adds, it seems to me, a further ineptness to the use of the term ground zero, because it gives the currency of nuclear devastation that actually feeds rather well Osama bin Laden's conception of what he was about. And I could continue with that, but there's more I'd like to quote if there were time from about Osama bin Laden, which is indeed quite interesting. But let me move on very briefly to say something about patriotism, in particular the display of the flag. The flags are, this would invite itself a talk unto itself on imminent symbolism. The circumstance of the United States is that it has a very poor visual culture. It has very little in the way of imminent symbolism. There's very little in the way of narrative symbolism, the sort of thing that you have to tell a story to unpack. Its common visual culture is very, very reduced. And it's no accident that this is the country in which the logo was introduced and defined as a mode of communication. Flags are culturally quite poor symbols. They have certain advantages. They're instantaneously present. The whole thing is given at once. There's no narrative of necessary decoding. Even if you don't know what it means, you can recognize it for what it is. And that's part of their attraction. That's why they served on battlefields as banners, places to mark the location. It's immediately recognizable. It's entirely present. It requires no interpretation or evaluation. It's unlike, say, heraldic devices with heraldic animals and so on. It's unlike places as symbols, people as symbols, texts as symbols, crowns as symbols, and so on, each of which takes a certain kind of narrative interpretation and indeed evaluation. To understand the crown, you have to enter into the concepts of sovereignty and so on, either to endorse them or to criticize them. The other thing about a flag that makes it very attractive to a society that has a very limited public culture of shared meanings and so on is that it is a skin. It's something, it's a contour that you can pass over things and envelop them in it and suddenly give them an identity. So you can take any arbitrary set of objects, drape a flag over that set of objects, and you've unified them under a certain sort of symbolic presence. Now, I'm not criticizing the use of flags. It seems to me that they are an important part of the language of public space. But I do have to say that I thought the near fanatical flag display was it stood in inverse proportion to the reality of the cultural, moral, and spiritual unity of the country. I think that it was possible for people who shared nothing in common, morally, spiritually, intellectually, and politically, to simply drape this skin across the surface of a building, stick it in their window and so on, and seem to be saying something in common about what we share, what we value, and so on. And I very much doubt that there was very much shared, because the underlying differences, the really fundamental points about what it is to be a nation, to hold values in common and so on, go unaddressed. In fact, there's the illusion of unity without its substance, and that's why flags are a bad mode of primary representation of national unity, because they have no narrative, evaluative structure. There's a story to be told about where they first came from and so on, but they are essentially superficial symbols. And I'll just illustrate this from my own country. The flag of Scotland is the Saltire. The Saltire was first raised over 1,000 years ago at Athelstane Ford, a battleground and so on. If I hung the Saltire out of my balcony, or had it on my front lawn, or pasted it in my window, people would come to me and find a way of trying to say that this was embarrassing. They would say, they might put it by saying something like this: did you know that somebody has put a flag on your front lawn? Did you know that somebody's got in and sellotaped this up in the window? Now, why is that? The reason is because it's the most superficial form of representation of unity. It's one that demands very, very little in the way of actual, substantial, moral, spiritual, religious, and intellectual underpinnings. Now, we can come back to that and discuss it, but I just want to very speedily move on. Yeah, I got it. The lack of understanding of the events of September the 11th. I've already quoted Osama bin Laden and his view about this as being the great Satan and the snake that has entered into the garden and so on, and how it is that this must be attacked. Look, if you want to understand what was going on in those days, and this seemed to me did not enter into the commentary that was provided amply on television, you have to see these things in biblical terms. He sees himself like a prophet in the Old Testament. Look, what sort of, this in fact didn't seem to be commented upon, what sort of towers are there? There are minarets and spires that are built up towards heaven in celebration of God. And there are towers built in celebration of man. And there could be nothing more potent, as it were, in terms of an Islamic culture, or indeed a Christian culture that understood itself, than to see enormous towers reached up to the sky that are not towers in celebration of God. That was one aspect of it. A second aspect of it that was extremely unfortunate was the flying around of the president around the country on September the 11th, moving him from one place to another. This simply confirmed the perception on the part of older countries that America is a nation now that lives in fear of suffering physical injury. This began to some extent under the Clinton administration with a military policy that blasted people flat but wouldn't risk putting American soldiers onto the battlefield, because it simply was become politically intolerable for American soldiers to die. And this seems to me is not to the credit of the nation, and what seemed to be confirmed, this spirit of fearfulness seemed to be confirmed in the circumstance in which the American president was being flown hither and thither on September the 11th. And that was how it was seen, and people should be aware of that. Just very quickly, what does this have to do with the culture of life? Well, here's the very interesting, I won't say contradiction, but contrast that stands against what I've said so far. In the United States, there is currently an admiration for Tony Blair, which is to do with his strong support of the US after September the 11th, and the fact that in those first days he seemed to be conducting American foreign policy for America by being the primary agent going around the world and talking to world leaders. But the really interesting difference between Blair and Bush, it seems to me, emerges over the issue of cloning and the current ethical questions surrounding that. Bush, you will remember, went to visit the Pope, has referred to the Holy Father when he opened the John Paul II Center in Washington and so on, spoke in praise of the Holy Father and so on. It is inconceivable that Tony Blair would do that. It's inconceivable that Margaret Thatcher would have done that. There is, on the part of British politicians in recent years, a relentless liberal utilitarian outlook. Let me just quote you, and then I'm going to stop. I'm going to quote from Tony Blair in his speech to the European Bioscience Conference. He speaks as follows. Our conviction about what is natural or right should not inhibit the role of science in discovering the truth. Rather, it should inform our judgment about the implications and consequences of the truth science uncovers. We should also realize, continues Tony Blair, that there are areas where even in exercising such judgment, there is more than one morally acceptable outcome. Now, this speech continues, and I won't burden you with that. I know time's up. I'll just make the point very briefly. First of all, Blair doesn't think that science should be answerable to certain moral values of the pursuit of scientific inquiry. This is inept and ignorant and inappropriate. It's ignorant because, of course, government funds so much scientific inquiry and sets certain policy goals. There is a context of values within which science goes on, so it's ignorant about actual science funding policy. But the second thing is the moral relativism that's built into that. Now, the contrast I think I want to make is this, that for all that I think the American public culture as represented by the media and so on is corrupt in certain ways, and for all that the flag waving seems to me to reveal not unity, but as it were simply something put over the surface of profound disunity and a lack of confidence about fundamental cultural and moral values, nonetheless the hopeful point is that you can have a president who can take ethical questions very seriously, believing that they're not just matters of utilitarian calculation. Whereas the old world, it seems to me, has entirely gone over to the ethics of utilitarianism. Now, time is up. The question is, where does this leave us? What are the prospects for the future? I had a lot I wanted to say about that. All I say is that I'm not optimistic. Because I think that the cultural revolutions that would be necessary to get us into better shape are unlikely to happen, certainly by our own efforts. Providence may intervene, and that would be welcome, is to be prayed for. But I suspect that they will only happen when there are further and more severe and more sustained blows to the wealth, the affluence and security of the United States. I suspect that the moral revolution that some of us hope for will not be effected by September the 11th, but may be a matter of yet worse things to happen. And I'm not necessarily talking about sort of terrorism and so on, but sometimes perhaps I'll share this, sometimes I think the best thing that would happen to America would be that it was struck poor, that it would lose its immense wealth, because it's its wealth that carries its voice in the world, not its culture, not its moral system. Those, by and large, are not well regarded, if they're regarded at all. It's its enormous wealth. And what I think America needs to learn, for its own sake and for the sake of the rest of us, because it does now lead Western civilization, is that matters have to be got serious, and they won't be got serious while this play of narcissistic self-promotion and material indulgence continues. Thank you very much.
The title I've given to these comments is, excuse me, let me get my watch. The title I've given to these comments is Cultivating Memory in a Culture of Forgetfulness. The task of attempting to educate students to make distinctions between good and evil, to think about the big issues regarding freedom, virtue, and happiness is, as we all, or almost all of us in this room know, quite difficult. Many of us, many days, are tempted to think it's impossible. Students come to us after having had their moral imaginations to varying degrees atrophied by a corrosive pop culture that provides little in the way of stories and vocabulary to help them think or even feel in certain ways about good and evil. There has been in universities something of a return to a core curriculum, but students are still typically left with the impression that education, at least humanities education, means reading a list of authors from a certain period or on a certain topic and learning to make insightful comments about texts, authors, and their relationships to one another. Without accepting his remedy, students concur with what Descartes has to say about his own education in the opening of the Discourse on Method. Namely, that it lacks certainty, and that especially in philosophy, all one gets is a series of contending opinions without any secure foundation. Although many faculty provide criticisms of capitalism in their classes, university education still fits quite nicely into a consumerist conception of the human person, as exercising freedom in decisions of preference. Judgments of calculative prudence or imprudence can easily begin to replace judgments about good and evil. Not just students, but faculty and institutions alike reflect the absence of a clear sense of the nature of the human person and of human life as a quest for wisdom and joy. Or at least that would seem to be the diagnosis of our culture and our cultural and educational institutions offered by Pope John Paul II in encyclicals ranging from Veritatis Splendor and Evangelium Vitae to Fides et Ratio. Many, especially philosophers, identify the chief threat or vice among our students as relativism. But where this exists, it arises less from a philosophical judgment than from a very conventional form of individualism. Certainly not from any radical desire to construct one's own moral universe. That Promethean task would require far too grand an effort of imagination and will for most Americans. Even in our virtues, we often suffer from a different and more subtle form of individualism, which Tocqueville defined as a mature and calm feeling that disposes each person to draw apart with his family and friends and willingly leave society to itself. The problem is that this can easily devolve into an easygoing nihilism, not an attitude of rebellion, but one of savvy conventionality, a detached, ironic attitude toward an all too credible lightness of being. One of the chief symptoms of this easygoing nihilism is forgetfulness, wherein the past is no longer a source of wisdom or obligation. Yet very few, if any, at this early date, at least, seem able to forget the atrocities of September 11th. At least at Boston College, where many of our students come from the New York City area, and where we lost 22 alumni on September 11th. Students were hit hard. A catastrophic event such as this opens a gaping hole in their sense of the world, their place in it, unsettling all sorts of assumptions and expectations. But lacking not only a language for good and evil, but also knowledge of history, students have struggled to put these events into some sort of perspective. They are certainly more eager to talk about death, about courage, and about the nature of evil. And this is an opportunity that those of us committed to the culture of life ought not to let pass. It matters a great deal that the students have publicly shared examples of heroism and sacrifice, and that these examples come from service industries and from the working class, the sort of lives they have been taught in many and subtle ways to avoid at all costs. Furthermore, while adolescents have always had heroes, in recent years, American adolescents have had heroes that have been taken most often from the private realm, family members, teachers, or coaches, whose heroism they could not expect many others, if any, to acknowledge. Now they have publicly shared examples of individuals who exercise courage in the face of certain death to save others whom they didn't even know. This clearly cuts against a tendency in our culture to see ourselves as utterly isolated individuals, bound only to those with whom we enter into explicit consensual contracts. Indeed, the events of September 11th, in part at least, captured or recaptured some of the classical conception of what justice was about: protection of the innocent and the public honoring of virtue exercised for the sake of a common good. We certainly witnessed courage in its classical Aristotelian form on Flight 93 over Pennsylvania. It seems to me that in this flight, two assumptions were put into question. First, the assumption that negotiation and talking things out is always the best policy. Given that terrorists were bent on destruction, it seems to me that we got the second best result out of that flight. The best result would have been for the passengers to have killed the terrorists and landed the plane safely. The second assumption concerns the assumption that Americans are isolated strangers, concerned only with maximizing their individual goals. These passengers entered the plane as strangers, but became a sort of band of brothers, willing to die for one another and to save other innocent lives. But many of the other examples, and maybe even these examples of courage on September 11th, transcend the understanding of courage as actively attacking evil. They embody the mark of courage that Aquinas found most praiseworthy: active clinging to the good in the face of seemingly overwhelming evil. How else to describe the firefighters who rushed into the towers facing possible death? How else, as I was just suggesting, even to describe those on Flight 93 who did attack, but all the while being acutely aware that death was the most likely outcome, no matter whether their attack was a failure or a success? How else, after September 11th, to describe the firefighters' patient and meticulous sifting of debris, hoping against hope to find survivors or at least identifiable body parts? Not just on the issue of courage, but also concerning our attitudes toward death and toward the body, we can discern in these events important lessons or confirmations of a culture of life. Indeed, the problem with the culture of death is not death itself, but an unwillingness to be frank about death. And it's seen even in the tendency to recoil from the body of the dead. Compare this with the devotion to the recovery of bodies, to the care with which firefighters and volunteers have attempted to salvage whatever they can of the corpses slain on September 11th. Think of the care with which bodies are then wrapped when found in a flag, in a ceremonial ritual, and removed from the site. Think of the weary, nearly despairing bodies of the searchers gathering around the figure of a cross, a remnant pulled from the wreckage of the towers. The power of appropriate rituals, of signs and symbols that enable a community to acknowledge the point and purpose of death and life have been evident in the funerals of firefighters. The New York Times describes these ceremonies as ceremonies born of a belief in the consoling power of ritual, a white glove salute, a black flag commemorating the last alarm, and the lone bugler sounding taps. For many of these ceremonies, there is no body to bury. A dirty helmet at the foot of the altar replaces a coffin. It is not surprising that the New York Times would describe a religious rite chiefly, or perhaps even exclusively, in terms of its ability to console. That's certainly one of the functions of the rite. But it's noteworthy how few firefighters have used the language of trauma or closure or even tragedy to describe their experience, and how, on this point I would certainly agree with John, that how often the media has found these words and none others to describe the events. They speak at length and in excruciatingly graphic terms about the burden of memory, about a seemingly inconsolable sorrow mixed with feelings of guilt over having survived. The very ordinariness of the individuals, combined with some shared sense of excellence in the manner of their dying, stands in marked contrast to the most notable public shared acknowledgments of death over the past 10 years in America. These were grossly excessive, one is tempted to say pathological expressions of grief for celebrity politicians like Princess Diana and JFK Jr., known to the American public mainly through tabloid journalism. The question, though, is whether these examples will have any lasting impact. Catastrophe is not a good long-term teacher, at least not a teacher of virtue, which requires habit, memory, and a carefully cultivated language. This is particularly evident, at least I see it, in our students' feeble attempt to come to terms with evil. At least momentarily, they have been shaken from the dogmatic slumbers of unreflective relativism. And they also sense that it won't do to say, this is evil because I don't like it, or because it pains me. Yet they don't know what to say. Young people now have the task of attempting to cultivate memory, a sense of moral judgment, and of knowledge of history and world politics in a widespread culture of forgetfulness. A difficult task indeed, one which universities, even Catholic universities, are not in a very good position to foster. There are many obstacles to cultivating memory in a culture where signs in New York City urging citizens to fight terrorism mean eat at a restaurant, and where financial analysts speak plaintively and at length about the new feeling of fragility in America as a basis for predicting that there will be a bump in the sales of household goods. Bush began promoting his dual message immediately after September 11th, calling upon Americans to be willing to make sacrifice, not to forget the massive loss of life or the heroic deeds of police, firefighters, and ordinary citizens, while urging us to get back on planes and spend money. At one point, Bush was asked what sacrifices Americans will have to make, to which he responded that we were already making sacrifices by having to wait in long lines at airports. Daniel Schorr, not a friend of Bush, the NPR political commentator, chided Bush for his unwillingness to speak frankly to the American people about sacrifice. Schorr then informed listeners what Bush should have said. There's a quote, "We're going to have to make sacrifices. There will be bailouts, not just for big business, but for the little people who have lost their jobs because of September 11th, and there will be no tax cuts for the rich." Sacrifice for sure means that the rich will be slightly less rich, or that Republican policies will be sacrificed for the sake of Democratic programs. It's hard to see this as much of an improvement on Bush's original comment. Then there are those who wish we could return to the culture of triviality, gossip, and petty squabbles, and those who see dangers in what they call a communitarian push to articulate a shared vision. They see this as a potential threat to free speech and a ghoulish elevation of mass murder as good for the polity. Of course, it would be ghoulish and perverse to argue in utilitarian fashion that any goods that have emerged in the wake of September 11th are worth the cost, or that we wouldn't give almost anything to have the lives back. But knowing what we know, it would be a culpable form of willful ignorance to deny that knowledge and not to respond appropriately. Russ Hittinger, commenting on a paper in D.C. that I gave a few months back, argued that many of the big debates in our country are not so much over moral principle as over what kinds of knowledge will be allowed into public debate. And in this case, many Americans want to suppress what we know for the sake of comfort and convenience, or because they are not willing to embrace the burden of that knowledge. Now, I've got a couple remarks here. Sullivan, who captured the sort of center eloquence of mainstream America since September 11th.
And he wrote on Thanksgiving in the London Times, he wrote a piece on Thanksgiving in which he argued that the successes of the past 2 months exhibit a truly American combination, the deployment of extraordinary effort to achieve an ordinary existence. This is perhaps, he said, the singular achievement of this particular civilization. Yet Sullivan's writings exhibit the difficulties of even celebrating the extraordinary effort that's put forth to achieve an ordinary existence. Difficulties rooted in the Lockean principles that Sullivan and many Americans embrace. In an essay called The Pursuit of Happiness, written in the last few weeks, Sullivan wrote, "Before the triumph of American democracy, governments and states and most philosophers viewed happiness as incidental to something else. For Christians, happiness was only achieved if you were truly virtuous. Happiness was the spiritual calm that followed an act of charity, the satisfied exhaustion after a day of caring for others. For Aristotle, happiness was simply impossible without virtue. Happiness was an incidental experience while pursuing what was good and true. The idea of pursuing happiness for its own sake would have struck Aristotle as simple hedonism. The happiness someone feels drinking a cold beer on a hot day or bungee jumping off a bridge was not a happiness he recognized. And for almost every pre-American society, other goals clearly had precedence over the subjective sense of well-being. Now, the description of Christian and Aristotelian happiness is riddled with so many errors that it's hard to know where to begin. In fact, it's a sort of marvelous summary of the standard misunderstandings we philosophy professors must confront in teaching college freshmen. The understanding of happiness as passive contentment rather than activity, the absurd claim that Aristotle thinks happiness is not an end or desired as an end, the claim that happiness arising from charity is a matter of satisfied exhaustion. That's a short list, a beginning list. Rejecting the traditional conception of happiness, or at least what he understands it to be, Sullivan concludes, not so in America. Here happiness itself is content matters of mere opinion or preference. In full agreement on this, at least, with Machiavelli and Hobbes, Locke urged that questions regarding the ultimate end, the summum bonum, be tabled as idle questions, equivalent to inquiring whether the best relish were to be found in apples, plums, or nuts. We'll have that debate later. Of course, Sullivan adds that government neutrality on happiness accommodates all kinds of happiness, including the more traditional. Some may believe, as American Muslims or Christians do, that happiness is still indeed only possible when allied to virtue. But just as importantly, others may not. It turns out, then, that the extraordinary efforts which Sullivan lauds in his Thanksgiving essay are not just for the sake of ordinary lives, but also for the sake of lives consumed by the pursuits of arbitrary pleasures. And here we confront the largest obstacle to cultivating memory in our society, since a life devoted to petty pleasures would naturally seem to involve forgetfulness of the very costs, the extraordinary costs endured by others to make possible one's trivial pursuits. Now, it might seem that intermediate institutions, especially churches, would be the locus for a richer conception of happiness for the cultivation of memory. But Sullivan brings to bear Lockean reflections on religion and democracy as well in the big Sunday New York Times piece that he wrote, Who Says This Is Not a Religious War? He began by arguing against the Bush administration's policy of interpreting the terrorists as operating from motives wholly other than religious motives. And in contrast to those who argue that violence
perpetrated by anti-religious political systems in the 20th century is of greater magnitude and much more concerned than religious wars, Sullivan holds that the two have the same root, the fusion of politics and ultimate meaning. And he goes through the logic here, which he applies. He finds the logic operative in bin Laden and Jerry Falwell both. The problem with the fundamentalists in the Muslim world and the West is, according to Sullivan, they have yet to learn from Locke, who in his letter on toleration, Sullivan claims, makes a compelling case for the stark separation of church and state. One part of Locke's argument, as Sullivan rightly notes, is that true salvation cannot be coerced. But Locke's argument is more subtle than Sullivan sees, working its way toward deliberately diffusing the volatile power of religion in the public sphere by reducing religious belief to mere opinion, where, as Locke insists, every man is orthodox unto himself. Sullivan admits it much when he calls the current war one of secularism against religion. And even in the private realm of mere preference, Locke seeks to transform religious belief itself, repeatedly equating Christian charity with toleration. And what could be more revolutionary than Locke's audacious assertion at the outset, in the opening paragraph of the letter, that the chief mark of the true church is toleration? Forget about one holy, Catholic, apostolic. If you want to exhibit the signs of true religion, you must outdo your ecclesial rivals in preaching, teaching, and practicing toleration. In another essay by Pierre Manant on Christianity and democracy, he describes the situation this way. The church says, in a more emphatic way, what democracy says about itself, by engaging in humanitarian and egalitarian overbidding. If my informal survey of the view from the pew after September 11th, sorry for that very bad rhyme, is any indication, then the Lockean spirit is flourishing in many American Catholic parishes. Where are we then? Are the only alternatives theocracy or secular subordination of church and state? Such a judgment would be rash, especially given the time that we're allotted here today. There are complex political and theological questions here regarding constitutional structures, questions far too complex for us to enter into today. On the side of the church, and I'm concluding here, however, it is important that it resist Locke's model, that it provide more than an echo of Enlightenment humanism, that it address the large questions of life and death, of freedom and truth, of virtue and happiness in its own way, by articulating its distinctive vision of the human person as a creature who possesses and is possessed by memory. Another comment of Manent from the same essay on the current relationship between democracy and the church is timely indeed. Democracy, he writes, no longer in good faith has any essential reproach to make against the church. From now on, it can hear the question the church poses, the question that it alone poses, the question, quid sit homo, what is man? But democracy neither wants to nor can respond to this question in any manner or form. On democracy's side of the scale, we are left with political sovereignty and dialectical impotence. On the church's side, we are left with political submission and dialectical advantage. The relation unleashed by the Enlightenment is today reversed. No one knows what will happen when democracy and the church become aware of this reversal. Thank you.
I'm disappointed to learn that Aristotle's so down on bungee jumping. I can't say that I've tried it, but now I guess I can't. I want us to consider this afternoon the way we use words. And, you know, lots of words have been spoken more today about these events of September 11th. That's a series of words that's worthy of analysis itself. Other words, too, such as war, an important word, terrorist, extremist, religion, freedom, civilization, love, and the word we and us and our. I'd like to focus on those words. Us, our, we. Why did they do that to us? How did they breach our security systems? What is it that we should do in response? And if we look at these sentences, we see that the first person plural is used in reference to we Americans. I think this is a time when Catholics should claim their identity as Americans with great reservation. At times to resist it, indeed. Indeed, I think we should have reservations about the use of we in reference to we Americans all the time, due to the fact that this usage bespeaks a kind of collective purpose, a shared project, a community that is, I would argue, a fiction. The argument here is complex, but the theoretical core of it briefly is this. Genuine political community is not possible in the United States, owing to the absence of a shared understanding of the good life, an understanding that must be rooted in a substantive account of the purpose of life, and ultimately of the author of life, God. But the United States is a political order formed on the exigencies of moral and religious pluralism, a setting in which such a common understanding is not available. Indeed, the genius of politics in the United States is that moral and religious convictions have been translated into interests, which can then be set over and against other interests, and then be adjudicated so as to achieve relative forms of justice and peace. Not true justice and peace grounded in the good, but nevertheless the best that can be achieved amid the various parties in a religiously and morally pluralist society. This kind of social setting and political vision produces moral relativism, the kind which says that it is wrong for parents to destroy their offspring if the parents think that it is wrong to do so, but not wrong if they believe that it is not wrong. The rightness or wrongness of abortion depends on the belief system of each individual, his or her preferences, his or her choice. This kind of moral relativism also bestows on people the so-called right to die, a right that, I would argue, along with many others, will be expanded with time to include not just the terminally ill, but also the very seriously ill, and the mentally ill, the burdensomely ill, the old and decrepit, the unwanted. As many of us know, Pope John Paul II has delivered trenchant criticisms of this kind of moral relativism, promoted in a liberal democratic culture such as that of the United States. Indeed, he refers to a kind of tyranny that can arise in the name of the will of the majority, a tyranny that preys on the weak and disabled, the poor and the innocent. It is this critique of U.S. politics and culture that should stand behind our reservations about claiming our identity as American. It is this critique, and in particular the dangers of the tyrant state, as John Paul II calls it, that also motivates my desire at times like this to resist the usage, we Americans. In times like this, it is important for Catholics to identify themselves first. It is in times like these that these Catholics fail to do so. The rejection of Catholic identity on the part of Catholics rarely occurs overtly or explicitly. Rather, Catholic identity is simply merged into American identity, as if they are perfectly harmonious, as if there is absolutely no conflict between them. And thus Catholicism gets subordinated to the aims and purposes of the nation, in this case, the nation state of the United States. This is not a new phenomenon. There's a long-standing pattern in the history of Catholicism in the United States, but it has come out most forcefully and evidently during wartime. On this score, it's helpful to recall an essay published by Randolph Bourne in the midst of World War I, entitled simply "The State." The essay decries the way in which during wartime a nation's population is transformed into a single herd that conforms to the aims and purposes of the state. In times of war, Bourne observes, the state realizes its ideal, which is that within its territory and its power and influence becomes universal. It makes a claim on all the members of the body politic. The state is the organization of the herd, Bourne continues, and war sends the current of purpose and activity flowing down to the lowest level of the herd, to its most remote branches. Thus, the state becomes, quote, the inexorable arbiter and determinant of people's businesses and attitudes and opinions. Bourne was an open supporter of various leftist movements at the time, so he was concerned with the ways in which control is exercised over the population by means of police, courts, prisons, and so on. But he was particularly insightful about the subtle mechanisms by which conformity is ensured through a complex network of symbols, attitudes, and customs that produce what he called the state feeling, or state enthusiasm. Old symbols are taken out and dusted off. Old slogans are put back into circulation. Public opinion, as expressed in newspapers, from the pulpits, and in schools, becomes one solid block. And loyalty, or rather what he calls war orthodoxy, becomes the sole test for qualification of all professions, techniques, occupations. This is true in the academy, he said. He was very chagrined by the fact that his mentor, John Dewey, had came out in support of the war. This is true in the academy when the herd instinct becomes what he calls the herd intellect, and also in the churches when Christian preachers lose their pulpits for taking more or less in literal terms the Sermon on the Mount. This is speaking mainly about Protestants. They can fire their priests. Catholics are stuck with theirs. That's a good thing in this time, can be a very good thing. The mechanisms that produce this state feeling are so subtle, so well dispersed, reaching every cell in the body politic, that conforming to it feels natural and right. Of course, one never says that they're conforming to it. Rather, they are aspiring to noble-sounding ideals such as freedom, justice, security. Bourne said that the state never does better than this. In these times, as he put it, war is the health of the state. Or in other words, there's nothing wrong with America that a good war won't cure. Think of all the talk about moral reformation in the last 2 months. Over the past 10 weeks, we've seen this dynamic of state feeling emerge once again. We've been rescued from Gary Condit and returned to, this is a good thing. War brings out a lot of important things. Return to heroism and ideals. The churches have certainly done their part to contribute to this state feeling. From the National Day of Prayer on September 14th, which was a religiously veiled call for war, by the way, which occurred on the Feast of the Triumph of the Holy Cross in the Catholic calendar, and in the weeks since as well, the flag waving in churches, the many prayers for victory in war, without many prayers for their victims, the relative silence on the part of church leaders and others to raise the possible immorality of this war. That is not to say that there has not been a lot of talk about just war theory. There has been lots of talk about it, but the talk has almost entirely served to affirm the justice of the present war with no acknowledgement that such judgments must be provisional, and with no serious consideration of what to do if such judgments change. Take, for example, the statement issued on October 8th by Cardinal Anthony Bevilacqua, the day after the bombings started in Afghanistan. He states that according to Catholic teaching, a military response in defense of our people is justified so long as 1, sufficient time has been allowed to exhaust all other means, 2, the intent is not aggression, but rather to attain justice and peace, and 3, that people are never targeted, innocent people. It then states that the intention is for justice and peace, though it doesn't explain how. And it also states that this military action is against terrorists, not against Afghanis. This is the day after the bombing started. And it laments the probable further loss of life. But curiously, it does not address the principle of last resort at all, which it mentions. And perhaps it didn't so because it would have been hard to argue that that had been met, since it was only 26 days after the bombings that after the September 11th attacks that the bombings were started, and most military people agree that, logistically speaking, it could not have been started much sooner than that. The statement, in other words, is incomplete, not very well put together, not very rigorous, but the point was made. The Bush administration has the green light for this action. A similar problem can be seen in a statement issued the next day, October 9th, by Cardinal Francis George of Chicago, who states, "This is a just war, not a holy war, not a war of religions." But then he goes on to explain that it is a just war because it is in response to a brutal and unjust attack in which thousands of innocent people were killed, and that our political and military leaders are using no more force than necessary and acting to protect all innocent life, and that they are engaging in diplomatic efforts as well, and that food is being dropped to the Afghanis. That's about it. Nowhere is the principle of last resort mentioned, nor the principle of an attainable goal, which would have been difficult to support since the stated goal was to stamp out all terrorism all over the world, a goal which would require an endless war. Nor the principle of proportionality. Here, too, in Cardinal George's statement, the effect is to give the go-ahead. Other statements by other prelates have had similar messages. This war is just. But what these statements lack is any account of the need for continuing judgments about the justice of the present war, thus giving the impression that these judgments, made within days or weeks of the overt attacks, are good for the duration of the war, however long they may be. On this score, the NCCB statement, which was issued a couple of weeks ago, is better. It provides a full list of the principles of just war and engages in an extended analysis of those principles and of the political situation in the Middle East, and urges Catholics to keep thinking about them. So here we have a serious acknowledgement that the war could change in characters and that it could become unjust. But on this score, the strength of this statement also is its weakness, because it gives no indication of what is to occur if this war should eventually be judged unjust. What if this war is judged unjust? What would the Church do then? What would we have to say to Catholics in the military service? Should they refuse to participate in the war if it were to become unjust? And what is being provided for them now in helping them to discern which actions within the war are unjust and in which they should therefore not participate? What virtues would be needed for Catholics and others for this kind of reflection? What institutional mechanisms are in place to sustain the practices needed to acquire these virtues? What is being done in the military chaplaincy to aid in this kind of critical discernment? What about the rights of conscientious objectors in the military? Are Catholics informed of them? And what about working to achieve recognition in civil and military law for selective conscientious objection? I pose these questions because I don't think much has been done about them at all. A problem that stretches back to the challenge of peace, which for all the hoopla was rather ineffectual. Go to your average parish and say the words, the challenge of peace, and ask what this means to your average person in the pews. And if they know that's the title to the 1983 Bishop's Pastoral on War and Peace, a turning point in American Catholic history, then ask them what it says. The history of the challenge of peace needs to be read in light of the Gulf War. Where were the Catholics reflecting on that? And in light of the present war. And this history really stretches back to World War I, when, under the leadership of Cardinal James Gibbons, the Catholic bishops in the United States formed the National Catholic War Council as a way to mobilize the population, the Catholic population, in support of the war. That was the original organization, which then changed its name 2 years later to the National Catholic Welfare Council. A year after that, it became the National Catholic Welfare Conference, and in 1964 it was renamed once again the United States Catholic Conference. The USCC, NCCB, originated as the National Catholic War Council. It's going to shape the way it looks at these matters. Are we, as a church, ready to take up these issues, which are issues of conscientious objection, to use a word which pacifists often use, and pacifists are not well received these days? But also it's a word which appears in an encyclical entitled Evangelium Vitae, where it is made clear that people are obligated to conscientious objection rather than to participate in intrinsically evil acts, including the act of intentionally taking the life of the innocent. Non-cooperation with evil is a moral duty, says John Paul II. But those words are words of Gandhi as well, whose view on non-cooperation with John Paul II also extended to the issue of contraception. How interesting these times are. Speaking of contraception, the biggest distributor of condoms in the history of the United States is the military. Are we as a church ready to take up these questions? Without an apparent readiness to take up the task of forming Catholics in the virtues needed to take up these questions, then all talk of a just war isn't very serious talk at all. And one consequence of this is that then the church will fit the description that Randolph Bourne gave of the churches during wartime back in World War I. These questions have been raised before, most emphatically, perhaps, by Dorothy Day, judged recently servant of God in the eyes of the Catholic Church, in her many editorials in the Catholic Worker newspaper, and also in her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, one chapter of which is entitled, War is the Health of the State. A month after World War II, the so-called Good War, it was Dorothy Day who raised the question that so few raised at that time about Hiroshima, which was, in the words of Paul II, a butchery of untold magnitude, and in the Church's teaching it was a mass murder, an act of terrorism. Not the first of that war either, as was shown in the article that appeared in the Thomist by Father John Ford called The Morality of Obliteration Bombing, in which he critiqued the Allies' carpet bombing of Dresden. And also by Elizabeth Anscombe before the war ever started, in 1939, or as it just started, The Justice of the Present War Examined. Dorothy Day is part of this tradition, which is capable of identifying evil as evil. She was also part of an effort to start what she called a mighty league of conscientious objectors, under the auspices of an organization called the Association for Catholic Conscientious Objectors. Are we that kind of church? Only if we secondarily identify ourselves as Americans and primarily identify ourselves as Catholics. I heard a story last March that I want to repeat in closing. In Alaska, there's a town in which there was a hospital. It was the only hospital in the town. And at a certain point in this remote district of Alaska, the hospital started to practice abortions. The doctors discussed it and decided that they could participate in this. So did the nursing staff. But the housekeepers wouldn't do it. They said, we will not participate in cleaning up after this. They were Filipinos. How interesting. They just knew it was wrong. Eventually, the hospital ceased to practice the abortions. We may be saved as an American Catholic Church by the Filipinos. I hope that we can become the kind of church who exhibits that kind of conscientious objection. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our three speakers and to you for being so patient as an audience. We're going to take some time. It's a few minutes before our official closing time, and I think we can go a few minutes over without interfering with the 3 o'clock session. So if any of you have, if anyone here has questions, I ask that you line up at one of the two microphones and please just feel free to state your question. I'm not going to take the time to call on you, but please do indicate to whom you are addressing your question.
This is a brief comment, to Professor Haldane and also to Father Baxter. One of the more interesting things in terms of the use of the flag in terms of this whole thing is one of the things that happened on our campus, Iowa State University in Ames, was a student pro-life group decided to have, at the end of October, a pro-life chain on campus and connected it with bringing patriotic symbols as well as remembering those who had died. They were confronted by a couple of people saying is, if you're standing up for the American way of life, why aren't you pro-choice? Very interesting way in which I just offer that as something for you to maybe comment or just to reflect on.
Can I just, does this go on? Yeah. Can I just comment briefly, actually, perhaps take that up, but link actually my remarks with something that was said just now, which I thought was very much the point. Look, in the 19th century, there was a debate in Britain, which John Henry Newman was involved in, Gladstone also, about the question as to whether or not a Catholic could be a loyal citizen of the Crown. And that was generally concluded. It was helped with the fact, of course, that Newman was a convert from Anglicanism and raised and formed in a tradition for which people had a respect and had a knowledge. But that argument was won by Newman. And nobody subsequently really raised the question as to whether or not a Catholic could be loyal both to their faith and to the Crown. It seems to me that in the United States that argument has not really even started yet. There is nothing that strikes me as more absurd than the fact that the Stars and Stripes stands in the sanctuary of Catholic churches in this country, that it stands by the side of the sanctuary. It's simply astonishing. If anybody proposed in Great Britain that the Union Jack be brought into a Catholic church, this would be met with the staunchest opposition, including from conservatives. It would be regarded as simply a profanity, the idea that the national flag should stand by the side of the altar. It seems to me it's absolutely extraordinary. Now, I can give you an explanation for it if you want it. I think it's to do with the social insecurity of Catholics in the United States, and there was something parallel in Great Britain. In Great Britain, Catholics were regarded as fit subjects for eugenics. I mean, there was a discussion in England. In fact, the Church of Scotland, interestingly, in the 20th century, debated the issue of repatriation of the Irish, and on the grounds that they were actually polluting the racial stock. And the argument was that, the Poles and the Irish and so on, these Catholic immigrants and so on, were sort of physically, visibly, deformed, degenerate types and so on. There was a debate that went on that, and of course it didn't get anywhere, I'm happy to say. But it does seem to me that I suspect that the Catholic attachment to the flag has to do with the fact that Catholics were very concerned to try to assure their waspish neighbours that they could be as American as the best of them. And I think it has something to do with that. But I have to say, it just strikes me as extraordinary that the Stars and Stripes stand in Catholic churches.
I want to make just one quick remark about that. I think that what bothers me about the symbol of the flag is it doesn't instill repentance. The cross does. But the flag doesn't cause us to look within ourselves with a self-critical spirit and turn to God.
I have a comment directed to Professors Haldane and Hibbs and a question for Father Baxter. First of all, my comment is a rather shallow synthesis of the two former talks. It addresses the issue of wealth. And while I agree that in America we have a very crass attitude in many ways towards wealth, as academics, we don't create wealth. We create ideas if we're doing our job, but I think we need to remember as academics that in many ways we are dependent upon the wealth generators of our countries. And I don't know the details of this conference, but if it is like other conferences that I have attended, grant money has gone into funding it and getting people here. And that money is produced by the people who are the wealth producers in our country. And I think it's very important to remember those people as we have the freedom to discuss the money and the wealth and the crassness in America. Secondly, to Father Baxter, you talked in an abstract way about just war and about in the future if this particular war would become unjust. But I would like to know personally, what are your feelings about the justness of this war, and on what do you base your opinions?
I feel that the justice of this war does not exist right now because a last resort wasn't undertaken. It could have, the United States could have waited longer in order to, before attacking, could have found out more about it. I think one of the other things that troubles me is that we don't know what's going on in this war. The controls on the press have been more well organized even than the Gulf War. And we just don't know. That's, I think, really difficult. Also, it's not clear to me that this action, military action, will achieve a relatively greater basis of peace in that region than existed prior to then. I think it's going to be very unstable.
Very quick responses,
Sure.
if you'd like. Very quickly.
I didn't mean to slander businessmen. In fact, when I get opportunities to speak to groups of Catholic businessmen and women and to help out with fundraising at BC, I'm always impressed, coming from academia, with the moral seriousness of many of these people. Not just with their money-making ability, which astonishes me, but with their moral seriousness. And so what I meant was my criticisms were more directed against the uses of money having been made and the sense of a life of arbitrary pleasure, which I don't find in these businessmen and women whom I meet. Maybe I'm meeting the right group, but I'm in fact much more hopeful about them than I am about my colleagues or myself.
Yes.
I would prefer to leave the Americans to grapple with the question of whether the strikes in Afghanistan is just or not just, which would be for me a very stimulating discussion. The only thing I wanted to say, I come from Nigeria. I'm just here just for this meeting. I happen to be an archbishop. I was in Rome for the whole month of the synod. We followed the statements coming from the Catholic Church, the ones you referred to, Bevilacqua, etc. I don't know to what extent Father Baxter,
Yeah.
Baxter, to what extent you represent a consistent trend within the American Catholic intellectuals. Whether you are a minority or not, I think I'll go back home a little bit more with greater courage. Because I was happy with what I heard from you. We were beginning to wonder whether the church in America was not even asking the questions you are now asking. That the questions need to be really asked. Was the world just? Is this the only way out? And where do we go from here? I come from a country where we deal with Muslims on a daily basis. We have our problems with Muslims. So it isn't as if I'm a Muslim lover. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Can I just briefly, just to reply to the lady who made the original point, sorry. Yes, I mean, actually, I began by saying among the things that I admire in the United States is the intellectual climate and the idealism. And that idealism is extraordinarily represented in private benefaction and endowment of the sorts of liberal arts colleges that I was celebrating, in fact. And so many of the policy institutes and so on. These simply couldn't function without the support of people who've made their money in the marketplace or in industry and so on. Obviously, my remarks are about materialism, and that affects people. You know, you don't have to have a lot before you can start to be in the grip of the materialist spirit, and that's really, I think, the trouble with America. It just seems to me it is too wealthy for its own good. I mean, I put it like that.
That brings me up to something that is worthy of comment, too. The money for this conference came because David Solomon is a pickpocket, at least in some respects.
I think in fairness to the group that's going to be coming in here, we'll have to close this discussion. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry, those of you who wanted to ask questions but weren't, thank you to the audience and to our speakers.